So the Absolute Universe has been going on for a little over a year at this point, which admittedly can kind of be a lot to follow, given the depth of the story arcs that we've seen up to this point in time. So, because of the fact that you guys love the videos that I did, where I was talking about everybody who was involved in Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers during Secret Wars and all that kind of stuff, we're going to do that here. We're covering Superman and Batman, and this is everything that's been going on with them in the Absolute Universe. Now, if you are interested in a video that explains how the Absolute Universe came into existence, you will find a link to that down in the description. But starting with Absolute Superman, he was basically born on Krypton, as you would expect. But one of the big differences between Krypton in the main DC universe and the Absolute Universe is that within the Absolute Universe itself, Krypton has a rigid caste system that's basically ruled by the Science Guild. Now, Superman's parents, Jor-El and Lara, were actually part of what was called the Labor Guild, which was essentially the lowest social class on Krypton. And in fact, they had to wear these S's on their chest to basically symbolize what part of society they were a part of. And so within this labor guild, Jor-El was a mining engineer and Lara was a mechanic. But the way they described it to Superman and the way that it's phrased in the comic is that, quote unquote, they were the hands that built Krypton while the elites lived in ivory towers. But for the most part, Superman's childhood wasn't really all that remarkable. He wasn't like a prodigy or an athlete or anything like that. He was just a quiet kid who struggled to fit in. So basically every teenager ever, regardless of what planet you're on. And in fact, instead of relying on the artificial intelligence technologies of Krypton to do his homework, Superman would actually do it on his own. But in effect, everything came crashing down when Jor-El discovered that Krypton's core was dying, that the planet had been overmined to the brink of collapse. And when a mine accident ended up releasing all these radioactive vapors, everything that he thought was happening turned out to be true. The problem was that the Science League just refused to listen, dismissing him as a heretic. But for Superman, he never really knew any of this. His parents never told him any of that stuff. And in fact, they were kind of working on building what was essentially a life-saving arc without actually filling him in on what was happening. Instead, Superman figures it out on his own when he's wandering the Redlands, which is essentially where his parents reside and is more or less the outskirts of Kryptonian society. But he ends up coming across these fields of like dead animals, there's green gas leaking from the ground, entire regions of the planet are dying. And while the government largely just dismissed this as things like gas leaks in an effort to seemingly prevent any kind of a planetary panic, when Superman and his classmates travel to Kandor to get a tour of the Science League, since so many of his classmates want to be a part of the whole guild, he actually ends up seeing his dad being drug away and then ultimately tossed in prison by basically the cops of Krypton. So Superman goes home, he tells his mom, she gets a gun, and then she goes to the prison to break her husband out. Not only that, Superman ends up realizing that the entire Science League knew the planet was dying, that their efforts to quote-unquote prevent a panic was actually them just hiding the whole thing. And instead, what they were doing is they were building escape rafts for themselves, and they just planned on leaving the citizenry to their fate. And so Superman, learning about all of this, ends up hacking into the Luminarium, which is essentially the AI database for Krypton, and then broadcasts the truth out to everybody across the world. Now, as you could probably imagine, this led to pandemonium, right? The entire world just completely descended into chaos. And for his actions, Superman's entire family was actually sentenced to death by the Science League. And so with Lara and Jor-El secretly building a ship to not only save themselves, as well as their son, their dog Krypto, it was also designed to save as many of their neighbors as possible. And they packed them all in. Now, it is important to specify here, it wasn't like every single citizen across Krypton. For the most part, it was just the people within the Redlands. But Lara's technology that she developed up to that point basically served as both a personalized spaceship for those individuals within the larger ship, as well as a spacesuit and a kind of suit of armor. The problem is that once the ship actually gets out there and starts to escape Krypton, when Krypton explodes, the entire ship gets caught in the explosion. So where the ship explodes, the suits designed by Lara basically turn into little ships, which keep the occupants housed. The problem with this is that they all start getting caught in the explosion. And so once the dust settles, for lack of a better word, Superman is the sole survivor of Krypton. with everybody else either being caught in the explosion or the ships of the ultra-wealthy being destroyed before they can even leave orbit in the first place. And so for 17 months, Superman just drifts through space with nothing but his ship's AI, which is called Sol, in order to keep him company. And so this endless loneliness almost drove him to insanity. And in fact, there's one point where he decides to fly his ship into a star in order to destroy himself, because death is better than this, because at this point in the story, there's no indication that there are any life-sustaining worlds anywhere near them. There's no habitable planets, but eventually Sol discovers one, a planet that orbits a yellow sun. And so as they get closer to Earth, Superman actually starts developing powers, which for the most part are the powers you're traditionally used to when you think of Superman. But because the Absolute Universe is somewhat akin to Marvel's Ultimate Universe, it's a more stripped down version of Superman that you would expect, almost more realistic. But in the end, he crashes on Earth, lands in Smallville, Kansas, and the explosion drew the attention of Jonathan and Martha Kent. Of course, they found a terrified, glowing kid speaking some strange language, and then they took him in. But while he recovered, his body started adapting to yellow sun radiation, which granted him all the powers that we're familiar with. The problem is that Earth is basically ruled by a handful of exceedingly corrupt organizations, which are led by exceedingly corrupt individuals. And in the Absolute Superman comic, it's Lazarus Corp. Now, Lazarus Corporation has a private army which are known as the Peacemakers, and they actually storm the Kent farm with the intention of capturing Superman to use him for his own ends. Superman does try to protect Jonathan and Martha, but ultimately they tell him, get out of here as fast as you can, so he essentially races off. And having been so disheartened by everything he saw, he actually ends up spending quite a lot of time by himself, with no one but Sol to kind of keep him company. For the most part, he doesn't want to have anything to do with the human race. But one of the things that Sol tells him is that while he is not technically an Earthling, that he shares similarities with them. The most notable of these being he needs to be able to have some measure of company. He needs to be surrounded by people that care about him. So walking away from humanity as a whole will destroy the one thing that makes him who he is. And so while he does eventually get himself involved in the affairs of humanity, it's not like the Superman that we know from the main DC universe, where he does it out of a sense of duty and nobility, right? Wanting to lead humanity into a better future. Really, the only main motivation for Absolute Superman is destroying Lazarus Corp. That's really all it is. And so over time, he starts helping people in secret, right? Fixing dangerous mines or completing work overnight at these different work camps that are ran by Lazarus Corp. He saves lives without ever really revealing himself. And in fact, humanity largely believed he was a myth, and Lazarus Corp considered him a threat. But this all came to a head in Brazil when Peacemakers basically discovered him and then unleashed a full-scale assault. So he protects the workers, but was ultimately captured by Lois Lane, who was a field agent for Lazarus Corp. But the kicker is that he actually protects her from being destroyed. And that's when she starts to realize he's not actually the threat that Lazarus Corp makes him out to be. And so while they do have some measure of a very, very tenuous alliance, the two of them do have an impact on each other, that Lois Lane's empathy starts to transform Superman, and Superman's perspective of Lazarus Corp starts to inform how Lois thinks about her own actions in relation to the world around her. Now, with the private police force being known as the Peacemakers, you do of course get Christopher Smith, the Peacemaker. But the reality here is he's not really Christopher Smith the way you may be traditionally used to, and he's certainly nothing like the one that you saw played by John Cena. Instead, in the Absolute Universe, he is a guy who was basically embarrassed by Superman, and then he ends up going crazy and just killing a whole bunch of innocent people. That creates a kind of small side plot where Superman has a personal vendetta against him due to the heinous nature of his actions, but it also leads him to becoming a more extreme person. In fact, it also allows him to experience modifications provided to him by Brainiac. Now, Brainiac is kind of a side plot in the Absolute Superman story. The long and short of Brainiac is that he is the lone survivor of what was called the Brainiac Collective. We still don't really know a whole lot about it. It just seems like there were tens of thousands of them, each one with an individual task. The Brainiac in the Absolute Universe, he was the sole survivor because once he was finished with his task, he basically went to to the bridge of the ship that he was on and found the Brainiac that made him had essentially died by suicide, and so he just took over that role. But he's effectively gone insane, is really all it is. And so his role on Earth, working alongside Lazarus Corp and its leader, Ra's al Ghul, is to just kind of have a chance to experiment on people. It's really just pure sadism. But it's Brainiac's modifications that actually present Christopher Smith as the first real threat to absolute Superman. And in fact, it was believed that Christopher Smith would have the ability to destroy Superman. But that doesn't happen. Superman destroys him in moments, like crushes this guy within seconds. And so while absolute Superman is ultimately captured by Ra's al Ghul, due to the fact that one of the things that absolute Superman had done is he had allied himself with a group called the Omega Men, which were basically just a resistance force to Lazarus Corp, only for us to find out that the Omega Men were actually being led by Ra's al Ghul's daughter, that in reality they weren't really a resistance force, they were agents of Ra's, just kind of being controlled by him indirectly, that Superman being captured and then taken by Ra's, the motivation of Brainiac was to actually mentally condition Superman to turn him into an agent of Ra's. That ultimately didn't work. Superman, alongside Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, who was actually a member of the Omega Men, ended up freeing Superman, and then in a moment of rage, he almost kills Brainiac, but ultimately brings himself down. And so what this does is it leads into what's happening right now, which is Superman, Lois, and Jimmy traveling back to Smallville and then basically marshaling their forces in preparation for a full-scale conflict against Ra's al Ghul, who again wants to capture Superman and turn him into a henchman. And so that takes us into probably the most popular title of the Absolute Universe, right? Absolute Batman. Now, here's the thing. Absolute Batman was not born into privilege the way you might expect. Pretty much everybody on the face of the planet knows that Bruce Wayne is super rich. He's got all the resources in the world. He dresses up as a bat and beats up criminals in the middle of the night, all the while claiming to be a sane person. In the Absolute Universe, it's completely different because he grew up in Crime Alley, which is Gotham City's poorest neighborhood. And in fact, Thomas Wayne and Martha Wayne were not ultra wealthy. Instead, Thomas Wayne was an elementary school teacher and Martha is a social worker. Notice I said was and is. The reason for that is because instead of being surrounded by wealth, Bruce is surrounded by struggle, but he does have friends, right? He's got Selina, Eddie, Waylon, Harvey, and Ozzy, who pretty much all you guys know as traditionally being Batman's rogues gallery. Selina is Catwoman, Eddie is Edward Nygma, also known as the Riddler, Waylon Jones is Killer Croc, Harvey Dent is Two-Face, and Ozzy is Oswald Cobblepot, right? The Penguin. But when Bruce was 10 years old, he entered into this citywide engineering competition, and the goal was to design a bridge that could help people in disaster zones. And so Bruce Wayne actually developed the entire idea based on bats. That his first draft looked intimidating, but it looked strong. But then his dad told him something that was exceedingly important here. And to quote, "If it's for people in need, should it really be scary?" But ultimately, Bruce Wayne wins the whole thing, which wins his class a trip to Gotham Zoo. And then a gunman opens fire at the place. Now, Thomas Wayne ends up throwing himself at the shooter in order to save the kids, and then died in front of his son. And so Bruce was trapped in the bat enclosure with his father's body until Jim Gordon found him. And later on that night, Bruce locked himself in his room, throwing away his medal and just pissed off about everything that had happened. Now after this, Selina takes Bruce to an old movie theater where Zorro was playing, which was the same movie that his father wanted him to see after they were done with Gotham Zoo. And while that was going on, the shooter at the zoo, Joe Chill, was ultimately caught and then sentenced to Blackgate Prison. And so while he was at the funeral, Bruce had this conversation with Jim Gordon where he basically told him that he didn't want the zoo to be torn down because Jim Gordon told him that was the plan of the city, right, to tear down the zoo and then replace it with something that was basically happier, that wouldn't remind people of the tragedy that had taken place there. Instead, what Bruce wanted was for it to be left as a standing memorial, right? Something that people could look at and remember what had happened. And so what ends up happening is that the city, for the most part, agrees with him, right? And what they end up creating is a spotlight called the Memorial Light that's lit once a year to honor everyone who died there. And so between the death of his father and the time that the story actually picks up, Bruce Wayne basically just spends his time training to become as capable of a fighter as he can. But there's a big difference between Bruce Wayne in the Absolute Universe and Bruce Wayne in the main DC universe. Bruce Wayne in the main DC universe has learned virtually every martial art there is to learn. But again, the Absolute Universe is designed to feel a lot more realistic than the main DC universe. And so I wouldn't go so far as to say that Bruce Wayne in the Absolute Universe is just kind of a clumsy oaf of a fighter, but he's nowhere near as capable and prodigious as he is in the main DC universe. But the fact is, his knowledge extends beyond simply just fighting. That between Edward Nygma and Harvey Dent, he basically ended up learning everything that he could about how to use technology to his advantage and how the criminal underworld within Gotham City worked. And so eventually Bruce takes all this pain from the loss of his father and turns it into Batman. But again, unlike the main DC universe, Absolute Batman is brutal. He is intense. He's actually much closer to Thomas Wayne in the Flashpoint universe than he is Bruce Wayne in the main DC universe. It is important to know he still maintains his no-killing rule, but I'd be willing to wager with the way he handles some of these criminals, they're probably wishing for death, to be honest with you guys. But the idea of him developing a no-kill rule wasn't something that he started out with. In fact, it's something that he kind of evolved with over time, because what he started to realize was that there's enough predators within the city of Gotham. There's enough criminals, enough people feeding on the weak and the needy, that what Gotham City truly needs is someone that the citizens can look up to. And so that's why he presents himself as more of a protector. He's a hyper-violent protector, but a protector nonetheless. And so the first story arc basically picks up with the introduction of a group called the Party Animals. Now, the way they were presented, the Party Animals were basically rich kids that had gone feral, right? They were like thrill seekers that turned Gotham into their playground, murdering as a sport. Bruce did hunt them relentlessly, eventually encountering Alfred Pennyworth, who's actually a kind of mercenary slash government agent that was basically sent to get information on the Party Animals as well as their leader, Black Mask. And initially, they don't really start off as allies. The reality here is that Alfred Pennyworth has his own mission, which is to observe and report back. But Bruce Wayne is presented as a kind of fly in the ointment, right? And so Alfred initially goes after Bruce to shut him down in being Batman. But in realizing that there's no way to stop that, he ultimately just kind of says, look, then I will teach you how to be more effective, because the reality here is you don't really know what you're doing. Now, one of the things that happened within the story that made it really fascinating was that there comes a point when Bruce Wayne is offered $200 million to stand down for a week. That initially, Bruce took the deal, right? And then he used the money to build a giant bat symbol on the memorial light, ultimately declaring war on the Party Animals. Now, the Party Animals do attack, and then Bruce was beaten and burned and barely escaped with his life. Alfred, of course, walked away, telling him that all of this was on his head, because at this point, Alfred has no real emotional investment with Bruce Wayne. And so ultimately, Bruce ends up turning to all of his friends for help, right? He reveals his identity, and together, they all basically discover that Black Mask's operations are tied to a company called JK Holdings, which is the group behind the mysterious Arkham project, which is actually this kind of private prison off the coast of Gotham City. What's kind of bonkers about this is that there were rumors abound that there were experiments being done on people at Arkham, but the reality is that once a person is carted off to that place, they never come back. So no one ever really knows for sure what actually happens there. But Bruce ends up meeting with an old friend that gives him a way in. Eventually, he does come across Victor Freeze. There is a moment where he's subdued, and ultimately he escapes Victor Freeze, and then it turns out that it's snowing all over Gotham City. But the snow is not actually snow. Instead, it's kind of a substance that's actually cataloging the DNA of everyone within the city, because Arkham wants to know who they can kidnap and how they can transform them. And so meeting up with his friends yet again, they basically end up going over the blueprints for the entirety of Arkham. And what they discover is that under the island's surface is this sprawling underground nightmare of labs and cells. And in fact, when Batman gets in there, the kind of things he sees are nightmare fuel. Not only that, at this point in the story, his friend Waylon Jones had gone missing, presumably taken by Arkham, at least from Bruce Wayne's perspective. We as the audience already knew that that had happened, and of course, he was going to be turned into Killer Croc. It was just a matter of how he was going to look. When Batman breaks in to rescue Waylon, that's when he comes across Bane. And Bane, as he's presented in the Absolute Universe, is enormous. Even now, people talk about how insanely huge Bane is. That Batman, Bruce Wayne, is shown to be like 6'9" and 400 something pounds. And he is dwarfed by the size of Bane once Bane starts pumping all that juice into his head. To the point that when he holds Batman straight out in front of him, Batman's entire height from foot to head is about as high as the torso of Bane. It's insane how huge he was. But Bane doesn't actually kill Batman. Instead, he just demonstrates the fact that he could kill Batman anytime he wanted to. And so over the course of the next few months, while Bruce Wayne is being held in Arkham, he's actually subjected to just torture and all kinds of surgeries. That the doctors actually subjected him to seemingly the same surgical procedure that Bane had undertaken. And one of the cool elements is that the venom tubes, if we want to call them that, in Bruce Wayne are in the shape of a bat on his back. But because of the fact that regardless of this being an alternate reality that's designed to be more real world, it is still Batman, which means Batman does Batman things. And so there comes a point when he actually orchestrates an escape from his cell by refusing to eat and then taking a tube and pushing it down into his stomach and then squirting his stomach acid at one of the orderlies. Of course, once he makes his escape, he ends up discovering Waylon Jones proper and realizing that he's been transformed into Killer Croc. But of course, because Waylon still seems to have some measure of his cognitive functions, he actually ends up helping Bruce Wayne get out of Arkham. And so once he shows back up, Bruce realizes that Bane had arrived at Gotham before he did, and Bane had hunted down all of his friends and had basically mutilated him. He burned half the face of Harvey Dent. He physically crushed Ozzy with his bare hands, basically crumpling him down like a piece of paper, and that's why he's in a shortened stature and would basically become the Penguin. And so as it stands right now within the Absolute Batman comics, he's effectively preparing to go to war against Bane and Arkham. But one of the big things that Bruce does not know about is that Bane is simply just a henchman, that Bane actually answers to Absolute Joker. And Absolute Joker is the one that turned Bane into what he is, with the intention being that Bane would basically go back to Santa Prisca, be able to live his life out with some measure of peace, and he would be replaced by a modified version of Batman who would now serve the same role that Bane is serving. Bruce Wayne has no clue this is their intention. So we're kind of left with this bit of a mystery. Is this guy marching headlong into his own demise? Which we'll probably find out tomorrow. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully this fills you guys in on everything that's going on. Again, there's a lot of stuff that happened and there's a lot of things that we haven't necessarily accounted for here. So that's why I'll have the playlist down in the description so you can watch all those videos from start to finish and get all the little gritty details that we didn't necessarily include. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button and I will catch you all later. Peace.